Today in Art of Supply, I'm joined by Anne Reinke. She's the CEO and president of the Intermodal Association of North America. She and I actually connected on LinkedIn in response to one of my other stories about over the road cargo theft. And so you just never know where a piece of conversation is going to lead you. And in this case, it's led me to a fantastic conversation. So, hi, Anne. Thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you, Kelly. I appreciate it.
So, just to give people an opportunity to get to know you a little bit better before we get into our main topics, can you talk a little bit about your professional journey up to?
Well, I went to law school, and many people go to law school because they don't know exactly what else to do with their lives. Right. But then I ended up actually, I really did want to be a lawyer until I was a lawyer. And then I realized I didn't want to be a lawyer. So I was a lawyer ever so briefly. And then I thought, well, advocacy takes many different shapes. It's like you can be
Absolutely.
a salesman and you can advocate for your product. You can be a lobbyist and advocate for your company and its issues, or you could be a lawyer and advocate for your client. So then I took the lobbying route. So I ended up being a lobbyist for 16 years at CSX. Why railroads? No reason. Really, there's no reason. It just sort of happened, and that's a longer story for another time. But I became a believer in the railroads, and then there was a whole bunch of shenanigans and corporate intrigue at CSX and many publicly traded companies. I ended up leaving in 2019 and went to the US Department of Transportation for about 18 months, which set me on a trajectory of looking beyond the railroad into a multimodal perspective. And I worked for 4 years in an association that represented 3PLs, the third party logistics company. And now I'm here 11 months at the Intermodal Association of North America.
Now, it's interesting you talk about sort of the private sector experience. And I will just comment, I love a good set of shenanigans, right? So, anytime, a little bit of
Many
shenanigans.
shenanigans.
But going from sort of private sector and getting that experience to then being a lobbyist and then going to be part of the Department of Transportation, especially given some of the, I'll say infrastructure related, although I don't mean it as literally, right, as roads and bridges, but it's sort of the whole apparatus and framework that makes goods and things move. Would you mind commenting a little bit on sort of the cooperation or coordination that needs to exist on this level between major carriers, associations as well, but also the federal government?
It's so interesting, Kelly. I mean, we could talk about this for the next hour, but each mode is so different. And, when coming from a railroad background, which is highly regulated,
Yeah.
both from an economic perspective and also from, just a safety perspective, obviously, there's a different relationship with the government than, say, gosh, ocean carriers, which is, largely non-US, non-domestic
Yeah.
company that have not for many years had but much in the way of US regulation until this Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2023. And so it's a very different depending on sort of your mode, how you relate to the government. And I would say the other thing that makes it so challenging too, or different, is how much money you get from the government. So railroads really don't get much, right? They invest in their own infrastructure and they have some grant programs that help with additional things like grade crossing improvement and things like that. But really it's on them. Whereas, if you're a drayage carrier or if you're a over the road trucker, you're largely dependent on the condition of the road on the federal and state government. So that which makes it sort of more of a push-pull relationship. And I don't know if that answers your question. It's just so different. Cooperation is critical. It's
Yeah.
just where your viewpoint is depends largely on kind of how you view the government's relationship with you.
Absolutely. And I think it's one of those things. So I spend the majority of my time having conversations in the private sector, although we've definitely had state and federal representatives on the show. It's interesting to start to think about some of those crossover points where you think, okay, now we're in sort of a gray area where we all need to work together. I think that's something that, yes, we read the news or maybe we hear about regulations. It's a big topic of conversation. But when you actually think about the interrelatedness in terms of funding and, like you said, needing to be on those roads. It's interesting how quickly you go from this scale of transportation to sort of bumping into needing to have a relationship with the government.
Yeah, I mean, I'm one of those sort of holy rollers as it relates to talking to the government. I mean, nobody loves lobbyists. I can't think of anyone I know who loves lobbyists, or and nobody loves the government. I don't think. But regardless, those 2 sort of opposing sides
Yeah.
need to talk to each other because the government cannot act without being informed. And while many people are expert in their particular field, they don't have the whole view. And so that's why, you have someone go up and meet with the government from a company to talk about whatever the issue is. Because how could they possibly know? And
Right.
particularly when you think about Congress, you have 535 people who have to come up with viewpoints on any number of issues.
Yeah.
How could they possibly know what the ins and outs of a particular issue are? They can't be an expert on everything. And so that's sort of why you need to have someone who goes up there and talks about your
Yeah.
issue.
Now, speaking about expertise, until you and I had connected, I don't think I would have thought about intermodal as an industry. I would have thought about it maybe as a descriptor, maybe an
Mhm.
approach to moving freight, but I wouldn't
Yeah.
have thought about it as a sort of a consolidated, very formal, structured idea. How is formal intermodal different from just having goods that switch modes of transportation during their journey?
Yeah, I would say this, it's a contract at the beginning before you even think about, all right, how are my goods going to move? You have to have those conversations. And so if you have someone say at an intermodal marketing company, which represents a large portion of our members, they will say, here's what I think is going to be a pretty attractive move for you. And it's here's where it starts and here's how it ends. And it's going to be a truck like product, so to speak, but they're going to be these different modal uses along the way, and it really depends on, from ramp to ramp, you'll have your dray carrier at the first mile and last mile. In the middle, you have the railroad, and if you're going international, of course, you have the ocean
Yeah.
carrier. And so it's not just something that just happens. It has to be designed in advance. And, and we'll get into this. Typically, intermodal is a competitor to over the road when over the road has sort of scarce capacity.
Okay.
And obviously that drives up price. And so, as you know, and we'll talk about, over the road does not have scarce capacity at the moment.
Yeah, not right now. Yeah. Now, is it a lot of the same carriers? So I know that it all has to be planned out in advance, but if we think of sort of well-known names and some of these individual channels, is it likely to be the same players participating when it's actually an intermodal shipment, or is it a different set of companies that this is their specialty and this is how they move freight?
Yeah, so it depends. I think they're, for example, JB Hunt, obviously well-known
Yeah.
intermodal company. All of the railroads, the class one railroads and some of the short line railroads do intermodal depending on, some have a much more heavy investment in it and some don't, but all of them do it. How so there are some who truly specialize, but, there are those who kind of flirt with intermodal. And so they'll they'll dedicate some portion of
Okay.
their sort of shipment base to intermodal, and our hope as an industry and me as the head of the industry association is to convert more of those folks who are flirting with us
Okay.
long-term long-term engagement,
Committed relationships.
committed relation.
One more question, sort of structurally, about intermodal. If you make the decision from the outset that whether you're committed or you're flirting, you're going
Yeah.
to send goods via intermodal, does that change in any way when the handover of ownership of the property actually takes place? Or is it similar if it were just to be going on a not formally intermodal, but whatever different methods of transportation channel you need to go through to get those goods from point A to point B?
Yeah, it typically does not, and so what it will be determined on the bill of lading, so the shipper will turn over the product to go on board and take responsibility for all of that, and then once it is received, that is when the destination, the sort of end
Yeah,
consumer will take responsibility. So it's kind of that way, so we don't you don't transfer it up until it's actually received, if that makes sense.
sure. Now, you talked a little bit about OTR capacity, and certainly the cost that's connected to that is going to drive people to make different kinds of decisions. Are there other trends driving demand, either up or down, for intermodal that you're keeping an eye on?
Yeah, I mean, and you know that, Kelly, we could talk for hours about the impacts of the pandemic on everything, but
Absolutely.
and I'm sure you you have. It's like you can't even scratch the surface. You started to talk about it, there's more to say. But so the railroad service is also another kind of factor that makes what do they say? Our destiny is not entirely in our own hands. So we
Yes.
have the truck over the road truck capacity and price being one, and then rail service being another. During the pandemic, which is why I mentioned the pandemic, rail service went quite poorly for a number of reasons that we can get into. And so when you have poor rail service, that does not make rail and intermodal a competitive product. Now rail service has actually rebounded. It's doing far better. So intermodal has has sort of improved from that perspective. But on the other hand, of course, you still have this excess truck capacity. What we'd love to do is not make the destiny slightly more within our own control, meaning
Yeah.
people choose intermodal because it is the highest best use of the mode and because it does provide a product at a great price. And maybe by the time I retire, we will achieve it.
And hopefully this conversation in some way sort of helps on that
That's
journey.
right.
So we've thought a little bit about the relative cost compared to other modes of transportation. But I mean, half my audience is supply chain and half procurement. So you say the word savings and everybody's going to go, yep, that's always one of the objectives on the list for every single kind of business decision being made, either savings or cost management. But are there factors beyond that, whether it be risk, whether it be thought about emissions, whether it be any of those other business drivers, even beyond cost, that end up being a convincing part of the business case to either try out or expand into intermodal?
Yeah, I think there's 2. So one is sustainability, and because, like, you are going to a lower emitting mode of transportation in a railroad for the longer distances. And so to the extent that there are companies that have sustainability goals, or if they're publicly traded and they have various requirements based on, ISS and all the kind of investment
Sure.
washers and things like that, then so sustainability does matter. And of course, if you care about the earth, then of course sustainability matters. So that's one kind of, thought in the back of your mind. You're using the motor carrier. And we certainly would never want to not use the motor carrier because it's an incredibly important
Right.
component. But you're using it for where it makes sense in those shorter distances, right? So less than 500 miles, and in the case of intermodal, it's the first mile, last mile. I would say the other thing is, and this is a big debate, and I never want to wade into a big debate and say affirmatively what my view is if I don't want to piss anybody off. But the driver shortage debate
Yeah.
is kind of obviated by the fact that, all right, let's just say, and I think most people agree that there are fewer people who are interested in driving over the road for very long distances. And when I'm talking very long, much longer than 500 miles.
Yeah.
So if we can agree on that without taking a position on a driver shortage, then that to me means, well, intermodal is obviously the best choice because in that case, we don't have to worry about there being insufficient labor to take over the move.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you bring that up, and I'm not going to get you in trouble, Anne. So I'll just share the fact that it's interesting to me, week in and week out, I'm covering different transportation related topics across channels. It's amazing to me how often this year something has come back to that question of the polarization around, is there a driver shortage?
Yeah, isn't that bananas?
It's really interesting, and so maybe for anybody that hasn't caught it in the other episodes that I've done that touched on this, it's sort of a question of, okay, is it literally there aren't enough people to move the trucks? Or this is where the questions start to come in. Is it that there's very high turnover? And so you're always constantly looking to
Right.
backfill. Is it that you're saying, well, yes, can my 17-year-old drive? Yes. Do you want her behind the wheel of your 18-wheeler? Probably not. I would recommend against it, although she would take you up on the offer. The qualifications that you're looking for in a driver, yes, there's a driver, but if it doesn't meet your standards based on your company's service level or risk appetite, that person in a way almost doesn't exist if they don't meet that threshold. So it's a really interesting debate that even with intermodal, that's an issue that's coming up in terms of influencing people's thinking about how they choose to move their goods.
Right. I mean, it's sort of we all wish that we had facts that we all could agree to, but I mean, in this particular case, it's not even about facts. It's more about it starts becoming about quality of life. And
Yes.
so if there are people who could drive, but they aren't driving because they don't want to drive because it's
Yeah.
not a great lifestyle for them to go 1,000 to 1,500 miles. Well, does that mean there's a driver shortage, right? So instead of opining, it's like, well, if that actually exists, then
Yeah,
let's use railroads for that
absolutely.
distance, you know?
Now, the other issue that has come up a lot, and as I said in the opening, this was one of the things that helped you and I initially connect, is the issue of cargo security. And we've covered this with regard to rail, we've covered this with regard to OTR. It's an unbelievable problem. Do you think that this is sort of one major overarching problem, or is it a little bit different by mode of transport when we look at maybe where are the risk areas, where are the weak spots?
Yeah, so, we were talking about it and is like kissing cousins or maybe ugly cousins, I don't know. But, like, on the over the road side, it's really there's cargo theft, obviously, but
Yeah,
there's a greater prevalence of freight fraud and what they call double brokering,
yeah,
and that's because the marketplace is much more saturated. There are far more, trucking companies, and so it's a little bit easier to get these kind of MC numbers and
yeah,
perpetuate a fraud. On the rail side, cargo theft is dramatically more resonant,
yeah.
and it's because there are fewer railroads, right? And so the railroad marketplace and the intermodal marketplace is just a little narrower, and there are various different kind of ways that we know that marketplace. So fraud is not as big of a deal.
Now, does the way intermodal works help shippers address this problem different than other modes of transportation or even multiple modes, but not formally pre-planned as intermodal before the trip starts?
Yeah, I mean, what's unfortunate is that you can there are many ways to sort of guard against it, right? So the placement of the container is a big one. If you put it in the bottom of the well, then that can potentially guard against it. If you when you're transferring it from truck to rail and you put it in a, lit guarded area, the intermodal yard, that can be enormously helpful. And obviously, if the shipper puts the heaviest and biggest seals or additional locks
Yeah,
on the container doors or has sensors for the container doors, which many companies are doing now, that can be helpful. But what we've all seen is that it can be not just a crime of opportunity, but a strategic crime.
yeah,
And so that there is an ability for them, regardless of all these things, to still either when the railroad or the carrier is on the road. So doing that first mile, last mile, or on a railroad
mhm,
track in the middle of a sort of unpopulated area, they can still get there and they can still take cargo off. And so, I think which means to say you do as much as you possibly can
yeah.
in advance, but you cannot protect against everything.
Yeah. And some of what I've read leads to it is actually directly connected to sort of safety concerns. I think in terms of if you get a package at your house as a consumer and it's got that sticker on it that looks like a bunch of different kinds of batteries and something that might be on fire, well, there's a really good chance there's something pretty cool in that box because it needs batteries. So, okay, that's a flag that there's potentially electronics. That makes that sort of a prime target. I know for safety reasons, there are sort of similar mechanisms on the rail side to indicate what's in this container.
Yeah.
Is it potentially a danger to someone that approaches the car for absolutely any reason? But at the same time, it's flagging thieves that are trying to be strategic. Okay, I'm going to skip the one with no stickers and hit the one that it looks like it might have a bunch of electronics in it because that's potentially a better theft opportunity.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And that's sort of the tension, which is, the FRA, for example, Federal Railroad Administration requires certain identifying markers
Yeah.
and customers now they have their own many times these containers that they build themselves. And so then they want to make sure that they're kind of comporting with the law, et cetera. However, you don't want it to be an attractive nuisance, so to
Right.
speak. And so where we fall right now is kind of in limbo land where we're just deciding, okay, well, we're just going to do the best we can and make it as protected as we can, but we can't necessarily put it incognito. Now, there are some companies that have their own, logos on their containers, and potentially, if they were to be motivated enough, they may want to end that fight and just have it be a plain white container. Who's to say? But the point of it all is that right now, I think where we're going with it is how can we protect it
Yeah.
in and of itself rather than how can we sort of masquerade it.
Yeah. And the other thing, of course, is how can we know where it is? Right. And this is another one of those
Right.
consumer ties. We've all come through the era of where is my stuff? And
Yeah.
companies also want to know where their stuff is. Is there a traceability or a visibility opportunity associated with intermodal because so much of that trip is pre planned?
You're exactly right, and you're pulling on something that I'm also becoming a holy roller on, which is visibility and data and having that sort of customer forward face so that, as you and I, the customer, I mean, I'll go track my package, right? We all try to track our packages. And so
Absolutely.
if you're a shipper or an end user, end receiver, you kind of have that same inclination. Now, obviously if you're shipping a bulk commodity like coal or gravel or something, you're probably not in that same headspace.
Yeah.
But these are folks who are largely in the intermodal space. So these are consumer goods. And so they do have that just in time notion. I think it is incumbent on the intermodal industry to absorb that and to kind of make it so that we move it and tap to the next century because we don't want to be left behind. Railroads, as you may know, have been around for 200 and some odd years.
Yeah.
And so they are early adopters of technology, which is not to say though that they don't recognize that this is something that is necessary.
Yeah.
How you make sure you protect the data, I think is something that they also are looking at and will look at. And each railroad, here's the other kind of challenge is because we have these different modes. So let's just say one part of the mode. So, there are railroads who do have their own visibility platforms,
Yeah.
but those visibility platforms may not actually talk to the motor carrier's platform or the ocean carrier's platform or the port terminal or what have you. So how do you integrate that and how do you have it so that everybody can talk to each other and they can all see where they are across the move? I mean, that's sort of like the next iteration, right?
Yeah.
And cargo theft to me is potentially that kind of raison d'etre, like, we could get there because of this kind of threat to our
Mm.
marketplace.
No, I completely agree. And I think, to draw a parallel, anybody that's ever worked in a large company with multiple ERP systems, right? Those little breaks where you're trying to either get a process to jump or get data to jump, there's always stuff going down in that crack. And then it's dark down there and it's really hard to
Yeah.
get stuff back out. You may not know that something has fallen through the cracks. It's so interesting because it seems obvious that, especially for a certain tier of carrier, they're going to have their own system. Getting all of that to talk, even if the organizations work well together, that is a very complex challenge.
Right.
So, certainly a worthy one to try to solve for, but not easy by any means, even with the best intent.
Exactly. I mean, the supply chain challenges of the pandemic created a freight office at US Department of Transportation and this initiative called Flow, where they themselves were going to gather this data across
Yeah.
the supply chain. So there is a model for it. I think it's just then can the private sector do it for itself? So we're not sort of commandeered to do
Yeah.
that.
So, and we managed to stay out of trouble talking about lobbyists. We managed to stay out of trouble talking about maybe there could possibly be, or not, a driver shortage. Let's tempt one more. I feel like
Ooh.
sport. We have to talk about tariffs.
Yes.
I generally assume that broadly tariffs, and especially when you add in general trade dynamics, are affecting everything, but I don't want to make any assumptions. Are some of the uncertainty being caused by tariffs and general trade trends affecting intermodal?
Oh, 100%. So there has been one positive of tariff imposition, and that was that we had a lot of volume front loaded at the
Yup.
first, second quarter of the year, right? So before April 1st, Liberation Day, and then it was that we had a pause, there was a lot of front loading of volume. So Intermodal's had a pretty good year by and
Yeah.
large because of that. But that means now there will not be a fall peak. The fourth quarter is looking
Okay.
really kind of flat and I'm not gonna say grim, it's just looking flat.
Mm.
And so, we're talking about volumes, like specifically volumes. Okay, great. Tale of two cities. Great. First half of the year, not so great. Second half of the year. But the larger point is companies that are invested in international trade are uncertain as to what the sort of final disposition will. We know the Supreme Court is going to be reviewing these
Yeah.
tariffs right now and Trump's authority to impose them. So that means they're not making investment decisions that could potentially affect if it's going to be undercut by the Supreme Court ruling or if Trump's
Mhm.
going to change his mind or what have you. They're just staying on the sidelines in terms of investments. And our ocean carriers are doing the same. And they have these, empty vessels going nowhere now that they sort of had to go, and so that's affecting their, um, bottom line, and so that's where we are. It's creating uncertainty, which means we don't invest, which means money is sitting on the sidelines, and that's not a great place for it to be. We, as an association, join with a bunch of other associations to talk about the impacts of tariffs on our business without saying we hate them, but just with saying, "Here's what the
Yeah.
problem is." It creates this uncertainty in the business atmosphere. For whatever reason, the administration is just I mean, right, last week, we talked about more, and November 1st,
Yeah.
there's gonna be tariffs on, heavy trucks, so it just sort of goes on, and I imagine, when you have this philosophical appreciation for tariffs, it's hard to move off from that. I just would say it's not necessarily helping our membership.
Yeah. One piece of that, you talked about the ocean carriers moving with whether empty or a lot less cargo than they would typically carry. One of the things I find interesting in all this is what ends up happening to the shipping containers themselves, right? Because when you have a very usual flow, we know the containers are bringing things from point A to point B and then maybe going from B back to A, and you have sort of a regularity, a predictability
Yeah.
of where the empty containers need to be at one point. With some of the different patterns that we've seen this year, there have been news stories about containers getting sort of bunched up at one place in the network. What would you say about the current status of not just container availability, but even them being in the places where there's actually demand for them?
Yeah, so far we haven't seen again, I'm sorry to keep bringing up bad memories with the pandemic, but we are not seeing those same kind of
Good.
impacts where there was no place to store the containers, let alone the chassis, and everything was piling up around us. We have just not seen that. And interestingly enough, I think part of that is because we don't have, for example, new orders for containers. Companies are not purchasing
Okay.
containers. There was just so much in the ecosystem during the pandemic, so it's sort of like, well, we haven't got anything new, so we're kind of our levels are a little bit different. So we just haven't seen those same impacts.
Yeah. And this has been a really interesting conversation. I know I appreciated learning more from you previously and today about intermodal. If we have somebody joining us and listening in or watching, and they would first of all like to connect with you, or second of all, like to learn more about your association, where would you recommend that they go to reach out and get more information?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn. If they wanna and Intermo IANA is on LinkedIn. If they wanna go to our website, which really is terrific, we've got a lot of data. We also have links to, some studies that we've done and our, volume data from once a month, etcetera. You can go to intermodal.org. It is really terrific, I think. I mean, of course, I think that, but I think it's really terrific.
I used it to get ready for this conversation, so I can second that idea. It's a valuable website that does also link out to other people's news stories, right? So it's sort of
That's right.
a curation or a centralization of news that's important to this particular supply chain topic.
That's right, that's right. And, you can find out too about you talk about containers. We also have this agreement, the internal it's called the UIIA, the Uniform Intermodal Interchange Agreement, which talks all about equipment sharing and sort of the rules on the road about as it relates to containers and chassis and things like that. So, to your point, you can get really specific information about where, how we're doing in terms of our containers and our chassis.
Yeah. And thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it. Thanks, Kelly.